In the last week of January 1911, a mine foreman named Thomas Rourke walked the number 8 slope of the Sunday Creek Coal Company's works outside Shawnee, Ohio, carrying a safety lamp and a crew of 6 men into a heading that had been driven by the company's own survey marks 430 feet past the last worked room. The seam ran shallow that far in, barely 5 feet of coal above a floor of grey shale, and the crew was cutting toward what the survey called an old fault line, a place where the rock had shifted some time before anyone alive had a name for the ground above it. What the pick of the lead miner struck that morning was a face of dressed stone, fitted without mortar, running floor to roof in a heading that had never, according to every map the company kept, been worked before. The survey had promised fault rock. It found something built instead. Rourke stopped the crew before a second blow was struck, and that single decision is the reason any of this survives at all. Within 4 months, all 7 men who had been in that heading that morning, 6 miners and their foreman, had been transferred out of the Sunday Creek Company's Perry County operations entirely, reassigned to slopes in Hocking County and Athens County, more than 20 miles from Shawnee in every direction, on wage increases that nothing in their personnel files explains. Company men did not get moved that far, that fast, over nothing, and no 2 of the 7 ever worked the same slope again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the crew found, and what a handful of company men were allowed to see before the heading was sealed again, was a wall built with a precision that the shale and sandstone of that coal seam had no business producing on its own. The stones were cut square, each face flush against the next, laid in courses that ran level for the full width of the heading, 9 feet across and just over 6 feet high, capped by a single lintel stone too heavy for one man to lift alone. There was no mortar anywhere in the joints. The stones held their line by fit, the kind of tolerance a stonemason spends a working life learning, cut and set by hands that were not cutting coal. Behind the wall, through a gap the size of a fist that the crew widened just enough to pass a lamp through, was open space. A chamber, floor-leveled, walls too regular for water or pressure to have shaped on their own. 2 men who were in that heading left accounts, both second-hand, both passed down through their own families rather than through anything the company ever put on paper. 1, a loader named Vasil Petrenko, who had worked the Shawnee slopes for 6 years, told his son that the air coming through the gap was cold in a way that made no sense that deep underground, and that it carried a smell he compared, more than once in later years, to a doused fire, ash and wet stone together. The other account, from a timberman remembered in family history only as Hollis, described the lamp catching on something pale stacked along the near wall of the chamber before Rourke ordered the gap covered and the crew out. Fire pits go cold and stay exactly where they were built. Tools rust in place, right where they were dropped. Hollis described a room left in order instead, floor swept, whatever it once held stacked rather than scattered, the kind of difference an experienced timberman notices without needing to be told. Neither man ever went back in. Neither man ever worked for the Sunday Creek Company again after that spring. The company's own surviving ledgers for the number 8 slope tell part of what happened next, and the part they leave out is its own kind of testimony. Production records for the heading past room 11 simply stop for 3 consecutive days at the end of January, no tonnage logged, no crew assignment recorded, in a set of books that had been kept without a missing entry for the previous 4 years. The next surviving page picks up on the 4th day, with the heading marked, in a different hand than the rest of the ledger, as abandoned, fault encountered, unsafe roof. One unsigned line, closing out 430 feet of driven tunnel, the company had spent months and real money cutting toward that fault. Mines were not abandoned lightly in 1911. Coal was money, and an idle heading cost a company more than it ever saved. The Ohio State Mine Inspector for the district that year was a man named Everett Dowd, a Welsh-born former hewer, who had worked his way up through the ranks before taking the inspector's post, and whose reports for the district through 1910 are, by the standards of state mine inspection in that period, unusually thorough, noting timber spacing, ventilation readings, and the condition of individual headings by name. His report covering Shawnee's mines for 1911 survives in the State Archive. It runs 4 pages shorter than the one he filed the year before, and it does not mention the number 8 slope's western heading at all, in a report otherwise careful enough to note which rooms needed better brattice cloth. Dowd left the mine inspector's office within 2 years and spent the rest of his working life as a bookkeeper in Columbus, a trade with no relation to the one he had spent 20 years building. Nothing in the surviving record explains the change. What is traceable, because payroll and transfer requests were kept more carefully than production notes ever were, is where the 7 men went. Rourke was transferred to a Hocking County slope near Sand Run at a foreman's wage 12% higher than he had earned at Shawnee. Petrenko went to an Athens County mine near Millfield. The rest were scattered across 3 counties, no 2 men sent to the same operation, in transfer paperwork that cites, in every single case, the same 4 words: company reorganization of district crews. 6 miners and their foreman moved off the same short stretch of tunnel and never placed within 20 miles of each other again, is not what a reorganization looks like. It is what a company looks like when it has decided a story is more dangerous, scattered into silence, than it ever was sealed behind rock. Shawnee was not the only place in the coal country of southeastern Ohio where a crew is reported to have opened something that was not coal. 12 miles north, in the Sunday Creek Company's Renville operation, a similar account survives in oral history collected from local families in the 1950s, describing a squared opening struck in 1896 by a crew driving toward what the miners called, without much further explanation, the old ground. That heading too was closed within the same season it was opened, and the company's surviving records for it are missing across the exact stretch of weeks in question, according to the same local history project. 30 miles east, near Corning, a third account describes a stonework face struck in a drift mine in 1903, met the same way and sealed the same season, remembered only through the families of the men who worked it, rather than through anything either coal company ever confirmed. What is consistent across all 3 accounts is not the coal seam, which varied in depth and grade between the sites, and it is not the company, since Renville and Corning were worked under separate local management from Shawnee. What is consistent is the wall itself, described independently by miners, who in 2 of the 3 cases never worked for the same operation or knew one another, as dressed stone fitted without mortar. What is consistent, too, is what followed: a closed heading, a gap in the paper record spanning the exact days in question, and a crew reassigned within the same season, never reunited. 3 coal camps, 3 different years, the same shape of silence laid over each one. None of the 3 accounts describe what, if anything, was ever removed from behind those walls. What survives, instead, is a pattern of absence built with more consistency than 3 unrelated mining camps should produce by accident, in a coal field where geological surveys from the period account for faults, seams, and water tables in exacting detail, and account for nothing resembling worked stone anywhere beneath the hills of Perry, Hocking, or Athens County. Rourke's own account, the fullest of the 3, comes from a letter he wrote his brother in Wales 2 years after the transfer, a letter that survived only because his brother kept it, and a descendant later donated the family's papers to a county historical society. In it, Rourke does not describe fear, he describes an order given to him directly by a company superintendent whose name he declined to write down even in a private letter, to say nothing of what the crew had found, and a raise that arrived in his next pay envelope with no accompanying explanation. He kept both the silence and the raise for the rest of his working life. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the existence of a dressed stone wall inside an unworked Ohio coal seam requires, if the 3 accounts are taken as more than coincidence, is a builder working underground in that region long before any recorded settlement reached it, using a masonry technique with no equivalent anywhere in the region's known architectural record from any period after European contact. Ohio is not short on evidence of ancient construction. The earthworks at Newark and the geometric enclosures scattered across the southern half of the state are proof enough that people were shaping this ground with exacting precision thousands of years before Rourke's crew ever swung a pick, raising embankments accurate enough that later surveyors measured them against known lunar alignments and found the fit was not accidental. Those alignments were not guessed at, they were measured, generation after generation, by people who understood the sky well enough to build a permanent record of it into the ground itself. None of that recorded architecture, as far as any published survey accounts for, extends underground into sealed chambers cut into a coal seam. If Shawnee, Renville, and Corning describe the same kind of builder working below ground rather than above it, it is a chapter of that architectural tradition that has never been formally examined, because in every case where it surfaced, it was resealed within the same season, and the men who saw it were separated before they could ever compare notes. The Shawnee Wall itself, as far as any surviving record shows, is still there. The number 8 slope was sealed permanently in 1922 when the Sunday Creek Company shifted its Shawnee operations to a different seam, and the entrance was capped with concrete in 1941 under a federal program that closed off hundreds of abandoned Ohio drift mines considered hazardous. Nobody involved in that closure program left any indication that they knew what lay 430 feet past Room 11. The wall, if it still stands the way 3 independent accounts describe it, is sealed behind a coal company's concrete, rather than by whatever hand originally sealed the chamber behind it, one layer of closure stacked on top of another, each one built by people who had no idea the layer beneath them existed. One piece of the chamber did leave the mine, according to the same family history that preserved Hollis's account. A single pale object, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, carried out by Hollis before the gap was covered and kept by his family for 3 generations, rather than handed to the company or to any museum that might have logged it, catalogued it, and lost track of it the way institutional collections from that period so often did. It remains, according to the family that has kept it, in private hands in Ohio today, unexamined by anyone with the training to say for certain what it is or how old it might be, because the family that has kept it for over a century has never once been asked, by anyone official, to let them look. That detail matters more than it first appears to, because the argument here does not rest entirely on second-hand memory and a company ledger with 3 missing days. It rests on an object that still physically exists, in a specific place, in the hands of people who have never hidden the fact that they have it. Everything else in this story can be argued over: the accuracy of a letter written 2 years after the fact, the reliability of family accounts passed down for a century, the coincidence of 3 separate transfer requests using the same boilerplate language. An object a private family has held onto for 3 generations and is willing to say so belongs to a different category of evidence entirely. It does not need anyone's permission to keep existing. Everett Dowd's inspection reports for the years following 1911 show no further mention of the Shawnee District's western headings, and his personnel file with the state, thin as it is, records his resignation from the inspector's office in 1913 without a stated reason, a formality most resignations of the period at least gestured toward explaining. Bookkeeping was not a common second career for a man who had spent 2 decades underground and risen to a state inspection post most miners never reached. Whatever moved Dowd out of that office moved him somewhere quiet, and fast enough that the district's mine reports for 1912 were filed by a temporary replacement inspector whose tenure lasted less than a year before Dowd's permanent successor was named. The pattern holds together across every layer of the record that survives. A ledger keeps 4 years of daily entries without a gap, and then loses exactly 3 days at the end of January. A state inspector's report grows shorter in the 1 year it should have grown longer, filed by a man who leaves the profession within 2 years of writing it. 7 men are transferred across 3 counties in transfer paperwork that repeats the same 4 words in every file, and none of them work within 20 miles of each other again. 2 other coal camps in the same field describe the identical shape of stone, met by the identical shape of silence, years apart and under separate management. None of these pieces, alone, would carry much weight. Ledgers go missing, inspectors change careers, companies reorganize crews for reasons nobody bothers to write down. It is the layering, one gap fitting against the next, the way the stones in that wall fit against each other, that turns a handful of ordinary administrative silences into something that reads, taken together, like a decision. Coal mining in early Ohio was dangerous enough, and companies were careless enough with the men who worked for them that a single missing ledger page or a single unexplained transfer would draw nobody's attention. It is the specific combination in this case, a structure that should not exist inside a coal seam, met by a response coordinated enough to erase it from three separate kinds of institutional record within the same season, that sets Shawnee, Renville, and Corning apart from the thousand other silences an early 20th century coalfield generated on its own, without any help from anyone in particular. Rourke died in 1947, still living in Hocking County, still working coal until arthritis moved him to a lighter job on the same company's weighing scales he had once loaded past for a living. His obituary in the local paper credits him with 41 years in Ohio coal mines and does not mention Shawnee by name at all, an omission that would mean nothing from a 4-line obituary written for a retired miner, except that every other posting he held in his working life is listed by name and by year. Shawnee is the one gap in an otherwise complete account of where a man spent his life underground. What the wall at Shawnee requires, if Rourke's letter, Petrenko's account, and Hollis's kept object are taken together rather than dismissed one at a time, is a builder working below the hills of southeastern Ohio, with a precision the historical record has only ever credited to the surface, cutting and fitting stone under conditions no coal company of 1911 had any reason to invent a story about, since sealing a productive heading cost the Sunday Creek Company real money in a business that ran on thin margins. Companies do not manufacture mysteries that cost them tonnage. They bury the ones that surface on their own and hope the men who saw them scatter far enough, fast enough, that nobody ever compares notes. 430 feet past Room 11, under a hillside outside Shawnee, Ohio, behind a 1941 concrete cap poured by a federal program that had no idea what it was sealing shut. The wall Thomas Rourke's pick uncovered in the last week of January 1911 is very likely still standing exactly the way three men, who never spoke to each other again, described it. Dressed stone, fitted without mortar, holding its line without help from anyone still living to explain how it got there. Nobody removed it, nobody dated it, nobody has gone back to look. A company decided, within one winter, that silence was the safer choice, and it built that silence with the same tools it used for everything else it managed underground: a ledger, a transfer order, a single line marked abandoned, fault encountered, unsafe roof. Whatever it was protecting itself from cost less to bury than to explain, and it has stayed buried for over a century, held together in the dark by whatever fit those stones together in the first place, without mortar, without help, and without anyone left alive who was there to say when. The wall never needed anyone's belief to keep standing. It needed only what it got: 7 men who kept quiet, a ledger with 3 blank days, and a hillside nobody has opened again in over a century. For one winter in 1911, southeastern Ohio gave it silence instead of an answer, and silence turned out to be enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.